for that nice introduction, Michael, and particularly for the book plug. And thanks also for the invitation to be here. It's pretty cool from my perspective to have all these science of sport minds locked in the same room for the next 2 days. I expect I'll get about a month's worth of work done in the next 2 days. And I hope I can kick things off with a slightly different perspective. I don't do science, or at least I don't do science anymore. I'm a science communicator, so I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can convey messages from the group of people doing science to the people who are in the real world doing practice, doing practical applications of science, and what some of the pitfalls are that we run into in that communication process. And so the title of my talk is It's Gotta Be the Shoes, Hype and Reality in Sports Science. And the story behind that title is that when Michael got in touch with me, he asked me to come and share some thoughts on how to distinguish good evidence-based science from pseudoscience, hype from reality. And at the time, I was right in the middle of reporting on this project, which probably most of you have heard about, whether you wanted to or not. Last December, Nike announced that it had selected 3 runners and they were going to try and run a marathon in under 2 hours. So this seemed like pretty much the paradigmatic example of hype, of big, bold claims that were clearly ludicrous and probably designed to sell shoes. Fast forward a few months to May, and Eliud Kipchoge on a Formula One racetrack in Italy ran 42.195 kilometers in 2 hours, 0 minutes and 25 seconds. So it wasn't a sub-2 marathon, and it wasn't a world record because the race wasn't held under record-eligible conditions. But it was a very, very fast race, 2.5 minutes faster than the current world record, and a lot faster than I or most other observers had thought would be possible. So I put reality in quotes here, but the fact is he covered the distance in 2 flat 25, and so it begs the question, which of the many promises and the many claims that Nike was making, which were the ones that had some heft behind them that actually allowed someone to run faster than anyone had ever run before? So I think it's a pretty good case study. So what I want to do today is I'll start with just some general thoughts, my 4 maxims of things you need to keep in mind when you're evaluating a prospective new intervention that you might want to try in training your athletes. Then I'll dig a little deeper into this Breaking 2 case study. And think about what we can learn from that. And then I'll just close with a couple quick thoughts about applying this in practice. So my first maxim, and probably the most important thing that I'll say at all today, is it probably doesn't work. Whatever it is, it probably doesn't work. I'm not just talking about sort of obviously crappy studies done by people with blatant conflicts of interest. I'm also talking about good studies done by good scientists with pure motives and the best of intentions. The fact is there are a lot of structural reasons that positive results come out in science and turn out not to be reproducible. This is a lesson, I started writing my sweat science blog about 10 years ago, deconstructing scientific evidence and trying to be skeptical about the claims made for sports science. I thought I was very skeptical, and what I've learned over the years is that however skeptical I am, I have to be more skeptical, and it's a lesson I have to relearn every year pretty much. So here's an example of an article I wrote 2 years ago for Runner's World. I cringe a little bit. Watermelon juice, the new beet juice. Now this was not a study funded by the Watermelon Marketing Board. This was from a very good lab in England by very, very good scientists. It was a well-designed study. It was a double-blind crossover placebo-controlled study. It had mechanistic outcomes, it had performance outcomes, and it suggested that an ingredient in watermelons might actually play a similar role in elevating nitrate levels that beet juice does. And so I wrote this sort of breathless headline, and in the years since then, those results have not been replicated. They've, in fact, even by the same scientists, they returned to this topic and found that the results didn't stand up. And some of you may know better than I do, but I haven't seen people sort of downing watermelon juice before races. So it's just a reminder that at this moment around the world, hundreds of people are studying potential ergogenic aids, and most of these studies will produce negative results. They'll be filed in a desk drawer. We'll never hear about them. A few of them, just by the laws of chance, will turn out to have positive results. They'll be published. They'll get attention, and so you have to start with the assumption that even something that looks good probably doesn't work. Don't be the person who's impressed by the first study on a new topic. Be the person who starts paying attention when the 5th study comes out or the 8th study. My second maxim is reading the abstract is not enough. I will say that from my perspective, I think the level of scientific literacy in the sports world has come a long way even in the last 10 years or so. I think most people are not reading things in runner's world and saying, oh wow, that's got to be true, I'm going to try it. They want to go and go to PubMed and check out the abstract and dig a little deeper. But even the abstract is maybe not deep enough. Here's an example of a study that was published in a reasonably respected journal a few years ago, comparing 2 recovery methods. And so it was a hard workout, and they tracked for 5 days perceived muscle soreness. And you can see for both of these recovery methods, it follows the same basic pattern. Perceived soreness rises and then gradually decreases. One of these methods is equal to or worse than the other one at every time point. The two methods are, the worst one is whole body vibration, which was done in 10-minute bouts once per day. And the better one was basically nothing. It was walking for 10 minutes on a treadmill. So it was the control condition. Now you might say, well, hang on, where are the error bars on this graph? How do we know there's a real difference? And in fact, one of the other features of this study is that it was a very small study, so it didn't have much statistical power. So if you do the stats, there was no statistically significant difference between the 2 groups. So as a result, the concluding sentences in the abstract were, these results suggest that whole body vibration is equally as effective as light exercise in reducing the severity of DOMS. Thus, whole body vibration may be utilized as a recovery option in addition to current treatments. So they did a study and found that this thing is worse than doing nothing, and therefore you should use it, according to the abstract. So not all studies are as bad as this, but it's worth going the extra mile, getting the original paper, emailing the authors, emailing people like me who are writing about this stuff, discussing it with your peers, and not just assuming that if you have one abstract that tells you something that's necessarily the full truth. My third maxim, you're the easiest person to fool. This is actually a Richard Feynman quote. I think the full quote is something along the lines, the most important thing is not to fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. What do I mean here? This is an abstract that was presented at the ACSM meeting earlier this year. They took a group of runners and gave them 1 week of running form instructions. So how to run a little more smoothly, how to reduce wasted arm motion, all that sort of thing. And at the end of the week, sure enough, people felt better. They reported a lower sense of effort while running at a given pace. The problem is that the actual metabolic measurements showed that their running economy was worse. They were consuming more oxygen while running at a given pace. So they felt better, but in actual fact, they were doing worse, at least in the short term. And this is it's not that surprising. Our perception of how well something is working is obviously affected by our expectations and our feelings about it and whether it seemed like a good thing and whether it felt nice. Now, I'm not saying that feelings are not a worthwhile thing to pay attention to. And I'll say this a little later in the talk too. Your perceived effort and things like that are important. But in a trained athlete, if you're looking for an intervention that's going to give you a 0.5% edge or something like that, don't kid yourself that you can detect that or detect whether that's working just by trying it and saying, how do I feel today? That's what experiments are for. They're designed to try and strip away some of these other factors and figure out whether it's actually working physiologically. And my fourth and final maxim is change your mind, but change it slowly. I've been running for 25 years now, so I have some pretty deeply entrenched opinions about what's right and the way things ought to be done. And it's hard to accept challenges to those. That's human nature. I do try and be open, though, to the idea that what I think may be wrong. But I don't wake up every morning, go on the internet, read the latest study, and say, oh my God, we've been doing it all wrong. I have to totally rethink. We should be running backwards, not forwards. You have to take new information as one more data point, not as an excuse to totally flip your thoughts. And so, a good example of this is the research on ice baths. And I've completely lost track of how many times I've written about ice bath research. And this, here's data from a meta-analysis. This was 6 years ago, so this is actually already out of date. But each of the dots, this is called a forest plot. Each of the dots represents a different study, and it's plotted in a way that if the dot is to the right of the center line, that means ice baths were helpful. If it's plotted to the left, it means they were harmful. And when it's presented this way, we all sort of understand that the important thing is to look at the pattern, not to zero in on a specific study and say, yes, ice baths are awesome, or no, they're terrible, but to understand, the picture is muddy. There's probably some factors that we don't fully understand that determine whether they're helpful and in what contexts. And most importantly, to be from a statistical perspective, to be a Bayesian, to understand that each new study is a data point, and we have to add it. We don't form our opinion on a topic based on that one data point. We add it to all of our prior knowledge. And that prior knowledge isn't just the other studies we've read on this topic. It's also, your experience as an athlete, your experience as a coach, your experience, the information you've gotten from talking to other coaches and athletes and other sources of information. Every source of information and every study has a different, level of reliability. But the important thing is be open to new information, but don't throw away all the other information you had. So put it in context and adjust your thoughts incrementally. So those are some general thoughts on just how to approach when someone is suggesting to you a new thing you should be doing in training, some of the things to keep in mind. So let's now dig a little deeper into this Breaking 2 project. One way or another, Eliud Kipchoge ran 2 minutes and 32 seconds faster than the world record. So what can we say about which were the factors that were quote unquote real that played into that performance? Before the project started last November, I went out to Beaverton and met with the Nike scientific team and basically asked them that question. I said, you think someone can run 3 minutes faster? What's your pie chart that shows you where those 3 minutes are going to come from? And they said they felt like there were 5 key levers that they could pull. And those were the athletes, training, nutrition and hydration, race environment, and being Nike equipment. I don't have time to sort of go exhaustively into detail about all these things, but the first 2 we can kind of cross off pretty much right away. The athletes were Eliud Kipchoge, Lalissa Desissa, Zersane Tedesse. They're all excellent athletes. In hindsight, we can say some were more excellent than others. But they were all going to run marathons in 2017 no matter what. So the mere act of selecting athletes didn't bring a 2-hour marathon any closer. And as for training, essentially the athletes did their own training with their own coaches in their home environments. Since this is a triathlon audience, some of you may be familiar with Phil Skiba's program, Race Day Apollo, which is used to analyze and track and predict training. They did use that. All the athletes were wearing heart rate monitors and GPS watches for all their training throughout this process. They were uploading this data back to Nike. Nike was analyzing it and drawing some conclusions from it and making some suggestions. But for Eliud Kipchoge in particular, they didn't change anything from what he was planning to, or from what his coach Patrick Sang was intending to do anyway. So whatever got Kipchoge to 2 flat 25, it was not any sort of new approach to training or more sophisticated ability to detect overtraining or anything like that. The third area is a little more interesting, nutrition and hydration. They did a few things, like they gave the athletes drink stations roughly every 3K or so rather than every 5K. And they gave them the bottles from a moving bicycle so that they wouldn't have to slow down to pick up their bottle. That's something that might start to kick in a few seconds. They also spent a lot of time optimizing individual carbohydrate blends. So they want different types of carbohydrate, different flavors, different brands, and they were mixing them all together in an attempt to optimize the absorption rate for each athlete, as well as the palatability and the gastrointestinal tolerance. So they spent a lot of effort trying to fine-tune these drinks. And so when the actual race happened in Italy, I was there covering it, and I was droning on Twitter about all the effort that had gone into optimizing these perfect carbohydrate blends. And then the race ended, and I saw this tweet from a small Swedish company called Morton, and they said, nutritional strategy is interesting. Eliud Kipchoge was having our 320 sports drink, a fluid containing 14% carbohydrates. And I hadn't heard anything about this, so I went and found one of the Nike scientists, and I said, this Swedish company is claiming that Kipchoge was drinking their drink. Is that true? And he said, no. You can go ask Brett Kirby if you want, the guy on the bike there, the senior scientist there. He's the guy who was handing Kipchoge his drinks. You could ask him. So I went and found Brett and said, was Kipchoge drinking this Swedish drink? And he said, no. But he said, well, you could ask Valentin, the other guy on the bike. He's one of Kipchoge's managers. He was He's the guy who filled the bottles. So I went and asked Valentin, and was he drinking this Swedish drink? And he said, yeah. He started experimenting with it a month ago, and he liked it, so we used it. So the scoop with this Swedish drink, it has two ingredients, pectin and alginate, which are supposed to combine in the stomach to form a hydrogel that encapsulates the carbohydrate, which allows it to pass through the stomach more quickly into the small intestine, where it can be absorbed without causing stomach upset. So that's, in theory, why athletes can tolerate a more concentrated drink than normal. 14% is huge. Does it work? Well, Morton hasn't published any data to suggest that it does. Is this carbohydrate actually oxidized, or do you just poop out a bunch of hydrogel the next day? I don't know. They say they've got a bunch of studies ongoing with external universities. I was in touch with them last week, and they said the first studies should be submitted in January. To me, though, the jury is still out. This drink has certainly gotten a lot of positive word of mouth. A lot of elite athletes, a lot of elite marathoners have adopted it. They certainly like how it feels. But until I see any data showing oxidation, to me, it's an open question. So I'll put a question mark there. There may be something going on with nutrition and hydration. If there is, it's not what Nike thought, because they actually had no idea. So the next thing is race environment. And again, there's a lot going on here. They staged the race on a Formula One racetrack, so there's no sharp corners, very few changes in elevation. They had a flexible start date to ensure that they could get more or less perfect weather. But the really big factor in terms of race environment is drafting. They had a 6-man arrowhead formation running in front of the runners in very tight formation, and those drafters were swapping in and out every loop. Every 2.4 kilometer loop, which is the main reason that the race wasn't eligible for a world record. They also, as Ross Tucker, who I think we'll hear from later today, as he pointed out many times, there was also a pace car driving 6 meters in front of the lead pacemaker with a big pace clock on top. So there's been a lot of discussion as to where the drafting benefits were coming from. Was it the humans or was it the car? My personal take is that the car wasn't a big factor, but it's certainly something that's still open for discussion. But either way, the point is there's data going back at least 40 or 50 years now showing that if you're running at 2-hour marathon pace, the energy it takes to just break through air resistance increases your oxygen cost by about 8%, 7 or 8%. But if you tuck behind another runner or a group of runners, if you're able to draft effectively, you can get back maybe 6.5 out of that 8%. And if you run the numbers, that suggests that executing perfect drafting during a 2-hour marathon should save somewhere on the order of 4 minutes, or depending on how you do the numbers, maybe even substantially more than that. And that number has obvious problems. We didn't see a 158 marathon or a 159 marathon. So here we run into a really interesting question of, well, what is the leap from lab to real life, and where do we lose some of the benefits? Why is it not working out in real life the way the equations tell us it should? And I don't have a simple answer for that. It's a really interesting question that has arisen. Nonetheless, even if this estimate is 4 times greater than reality, that would still be a 1-minute difference. So I think we can put a check mark beside race environment, that here we're getting to the point of this is what is one of the big contributions to Kipchoge's run. The last point is equipment. And here is the well-dressed marathoner of 2017. And we could talk about the aerodynamic arm sleeves and the nano-engineered yarn in the dimpled half tights and the no-slip socks. Even Nike would concede that stuff is all window dressing. When we're talking about equipment, the relevant point is the shoe. And the number that comes attached to this shoe, which is 4%. The commercial version of this shoe is called the Vaporfly 4%, because it's supposed to increase or improve your running economy by 4%, so that you're burning 4% less energy to run at a given pace. The shoe has generated a lot of controversy, rightly so, and a lot of discussion. To me, there's 3 key questions that we can ask about it, and in some of the discussion, I think some of these questions tend to get a little conflated, and I think it's worth considering them separately. First of all, do they really boost running economy by 4%? Second of all, if so, what does that mean in a race? How does an improvement in running economy relate to an improvement in race speed? And third of all, are they fair? So on the first question, my take is probably yes. There there was a study that came out a couple weeks ago from the University of Colorado, funded by Nike, which presented the data on which this 4% claim was based. I think it's a good study. It's done on well-trained runners, so guys who are on the order of 31 minutes for 10K. There's individual variation ranging from about 1.5% to 6%, so some people get more, some people get less. But the average of 4% appears to be a real effect, and that's compared to both to Nike's previous best shoe, the Zoom Streak 6, and to the Adidas Adios Boost, which is the shoe used to set the current world record. It'll be nice to see verification from other groups not funded by Nike and to see whether that holds up, but it appears that the answer to question 1 is yes. Question 3 is maybe the most important question, and one that I think has sort of faded from discussion a little bit since this whole project, but which is a shame because it's a really important one that we need to grapple with before the sport moves too far along this line. It's not the topic of my talk today, and I don't have time to get into it, but I hope people will continue to discuss whether these shoes are an appropriate part of the sport. Question 2 is where the interesting science is, and it's the same question we ran into with drafting. We have a reasonably good lab results saying you should get this much benefit in VO2 in your oxygen consumption, and we have an expectation for how that should translate to race speed, but it doesn't seem to be borne out by the performances, because we're not seeing people run 155 or 156 with the shoes and with drafting. So from a scientific perspective, I hope that this is one of the takeaways that people take from this Breaking 2 project, is that people sort of start to try and nail down where are the holes in the bucket between the lab and real life, and can we plug some of those holes? From a practical perspective, I think the important thing to remember is that proxy measures, proxy outcomes are not the same as real performance outcomes. And for athletes, you care about performance outcomes. So if someone comes to you and says, I have a pill and I can prove that it's going to give you a 10% increase in the gene expression of a protein related to mitochondrial biogenesis after aerobic training, that's great, but it doesn't mean you're going to get 10% faster in a race. And even if you can trace a logical pathway that should make you faster, those pathways tend to be a lot more narrow and twisty than we expect. And getting an actual performance benefit is what you should be looking for when you're assessing evidence as to whether something is worth trying. In a sense, that's what made this Nike project interesting, is that they didn't just build a shoe, show that it was 4% better in the lab, and say, Eliud Kipchoge wears it and you should too. They staged this big race, and they had Kipchoge run 2.5 minutes faster than the world record. The problem, as I said before, is that because of the way the race was staged, we have no idea which factors contributed exactly how much. If you were to pin me to the mat and say, what's your guess? How did he do it? I'd probably break it down something like this. I'd say the drafting was probably worth something on the order of a minute or so, maybe a little more. The shoes on the order of a minute, maybe a little less. That's more gut feeling than calculation, though. And the other stuff, whether it's the Swedish drink or the really smooth course or the bicycles handing the bottles, adding up to maybe 30 seconds. Now, what's missing from this picture? This guy. What did Kipchoge bring to the table? How fast would he have run on that day on a different course? Was he in 2:02 shape? Was he in 2:01 shape? Was he in 2:05 shape if it had been held in Berlin? We don't know. And in a sense, you could argue that is the biggest tragedy of the Breaking 2 project, is that we'll never know the intrinsic value of what was pretty clearly an amazing performance on that day. The positive spin you could put on it is that the marathon's a very fickle event and you don't get many cracks at it. And as we saw at the Berlin Marathon this fall, a little bit of rain can ruin it, or as Bekele found out, Kenenisa Bekele found out last year, tripping at the beginning of a race, all of a sudden your chances are gone. So at least we got a chance to see what an athlete like Kipchoge can do just once on a day in super perfect hyper-optimized conditions. So that's the glass half full and the glass half empty way of looking at the Breaking 2 project. I won't tell you which glass you should drink from. So that's the Breaking 2 project. I'll finish up just with a couple of quick points about applying these ideas in practice. First of all, if you're going to make a change in your training, especially a scientific intervention, measure it. Measure the outcome. Whether you can measure performance directly or a proxy measure like power, or these days we have a lot of options to measure things like biomechanics using wearables. There are definitely some questions remaining about the reliability and the validity and the applicability of some of these metrics, but the fact remains we can measure a lot more things and we can measure them much more easily than we used to be able to. Now, the one key thing that I would encourage you to also measure is how the athlete feels. I said before, don't fool yourself. Don't just rely on your gut feeling as to whether something is useful. But if you're keeping good training records and you're tracking objective measures like power or pace or things like that, and you're tracking subjective measures like how the athlete feels, and you're doing that over time, you should eventually start to be able to discern patterns as to what's working and what's not. And that, one of the reasons that's important is it's not just if you're trying out some wacky new harebrained idea. Maybe you're trying out caffeine, which is a very, very, very well-validated performance enhancer. It works very well for some people, but not for everybody. And it's worth finding out if your athlete is one of the people who don't respond well to caffeine. And you can do that by keeping good measurements, both of their performance and how they're doing over a long period of time. And the last point is you should keep in mind the differences between elite, junior, and age group athletes. Whenever you're applying a new training intervention, you're basically doing some sort of cost-benefit analysis that the effort you're taking, whether it's time and money and effort, is outweighed by the benefits you're hoping to get from it, whether it's improved performance on race day or ability to train harder and train longer or other benefits. This is triathlon, so it may well be that your age group athlete has more money that he or she is willing to spend pursuing 0.5% improvement than your Olympic hopeful. So it's not that there's general rules about who's allowed to use what intervention, but you have to understand that what makes sense for one athlete may not for another. You may have an elite athlete who's training more or less at the limits, their physical limits of their tolerance. And so for them, spending half an hour sitting with their leg in a dynamic compression boot or going to a cryosauna may be a reasonable investment of time, even if the evidence that it does anything is fairly ambiguous. For the age grouper who may be limited more by time, who's not really training at the limits of their capacity, that half hour may well be more usefully spent on the bike or in the pool rather than messing around with a compression boot. The last thing I want to leave you with is just this point here about psychological edge. If you were to talk to the athletes and coaches who are most gung-ho about pursuing every possible avenue, technological avenue for improvement, if you scratch deep enough, what you find is maybe I think, in my experience at least, they're less concerned with a running economy or some specific physiological improvement. They're more interested in the feeling that they've got an edge, that they've got something that their competitors don't, that they have a reason to believe that they can outperform someone who's been beating them in the past. And of course, I have mixed feelings about this. I'm all about using things because they work, not because they make you feel good. But at the same time, I think it's maybe a little short-sighted to just throw out this concept of a psychological edge. Placebo is a very dirty word in science, but in sports, where you might call it a belief effect, if your athlete goes 1% faster, ultimately, maybe you don't really care that much whether it was physiological or psychological. So this isn't an argument that you should buy a big vat of sugar pills and go and give your athletes, the Olympic vitamin and tell them it's going to take them to the top. But what I would say is, if you're applying a new intervention in your training, if you've done your due diligence, you've looked into the evidence and you decided that this is something that's worthwhile to try, bring your athlete on that journey with you. Explain to them why you're doing what you're doing, why you think it's worthwhile, why you think it's going to help them, and what the evidence is. Convey to them your enthusiasm and your belief in its potential, and have them share that. And if you do that, then ideally you're going to get the best of both worlds. You're going to be using interventions that have real physiological benefits, but you're also going to be helping to create that feeling in your athlete that he or she is doing the absolute very best training that they can do and will be ready to perform at their best on race day. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I have one question for you, and then I think we'll open it up to the audience to see if there are others that have questions for you. In reference to the 2-hour marathon, one thing you did mention, which I always talk to my athletes or people that I might consult with, is about pace strategy. And so in that, did they have some sort of premeditated pace strategy, and how might that have influenced the assault on the 2-hour marathon time?
That's an interesting question. So the race was in May, and throughout this process, I kept asking the scientific team, so how are you going to pace this? What's the optimal way? What does the physiology say? And they said, well, we can make pretty good arguments that it should be slightly positively split. We can also make pretty good arguments that it should be slightly negatively split. We can also make pretty good arguments that it should be perfectly even, and we're not sure which is the right one. So we're probably going to go with, probably the most important thing is making sure the athletes are comfortable with the plan. So we're going to go with what the athletes want to do. And so I said, well, what do the athletes want to do? And they said, well, it's a little tricky because one of them wants to go slightly positive split, one of them wants to go slightly negative split, and one of them wants to go perfectly even split. In the end, they elected to go with a perfect even split. They had a pace car that was assigned to just nail the splits bang on. And you know what? If you look at the splits, it was metronomically even. But you can make good arguments that no matter how you run a marathon, you're going to be suffering from some muscle damage in the late parts of the race. And so you maybe want to bank a little bit of time early, but then you can also make arguments which are probably more backed by the analysis of previous world records that it's better to not risk overcooking yourself early, and you should be holding back just a tiny bit so that you can speed up in the end. And in the end, so the way Kipchoge ran it in the end, he was on 2-hour marathon pace until I think it was about 35K or so, and then he just gradually faded, but he never hit the wall in the way that you or I might.
Interesting. And the other question I had was, what about kinematics of fatigue? So did anyone analyze the biomechanics of his running and how that might have influenced his pace maybe in the last 7 kilometers?
I think there was one analysis that someone did based on watching the TV feed, which I had little enough faith in that I didn't even bother reading. But to me, that's one of the big questions is, and when they first told me about the idea of the shoe, and we've got this shoe, and it makes people run, changes your stride a little bit and makes your running economy 4% better. And the first thing I asked was, what does it do after 30K? And they said, well, we'll find out. They didn't do any studies of that, and it's a big question, especially if you're running with a slightly different stride than you're used to. Are things going to get dramatically worse? As you fatigue, are you going to lose any edge you got? Now, the real world evidence they had is that they had been testing this shoe throughout 2016 with some of their elite marathoners, including at the Olympics, and the anecdotal reports were that the marathoners felt way better at the end of the marathon, and that they had less muscle damage. And so one of the features of this shoe is it has a very thick foam cushioning. It has very light foam that allows them to have a super thick heel without paying the penalty of weight. And so it's reasonable to wonder whether having this far thicker heel than or sole than you'd usually get in the shoe might protect people from muscle damage and thus allow them to keep their kinematics. But it's really hard to do studies with people that involve saying, okay, we just need you to run 42 kilometers as hard as you can on this treadmill, and then come back again in a week or two, fully recovered, and do it the same, or come back in some amount of time at the same fitness level. So they don't have that data, but I think it's one of the most important outstanding questions.
Mm-hmm. And just in terms of advice for the delegates, so I remember in my teenage years, I had a crusty master cyclist say to me once, "It's not about the bike, it's about the horse." And I think what he was saying to me was I shouldn't go buy that new fancy bike at the bike store, and I should work on my physical training. So what advice might you have to the delegates in terms of how much dedication you should put into physical training compared to, especially in triathlon, which is a equipment-driven sport, certainly, for especially maybe junior or age group athletes?
Look, I can give a personal answer to this, which is that I've spent 10 years writing about ergogenic age and the enhancement of sport through technology. I've never drunk a cup of coffee. I'm not even though caffeine is probably the most reliable performance enhancer out there, I've never used anything like that. I'm not running in any Nike Vaporfly shoes. To me, that misses the point of sport. But I'm also a little hesitant to extend my personal views to people who are making a living from it. And if I think my perspective might be different if you'd asked me this when I was 21 years old. So and my perspective might be different if my sport was triathlon rather than running, because it's easy for me to say all you need is a pair of shoes and just don't worry about the rest. Because I'm not racing in a sport where on the bike it's clear that technology matters. So I don't want to be dismissive of the role of technology, but I do think people should think very carefully about why it is they're trying to get that 1% and what it is they're trying to get out of it, and whether there's real satisfaction in buying success. Certainly, especially if you haven't already put in the hours to earn whatever success you can. So I'm a bit of a curmudgeon in that sense, but I also recognize that the pressures are different in the pro world. And if I was making my living, I'd probably sing a slightly different tune.
Thanks for that talk, Alex. I guess my question is about the point you raised about is it fair, and also is the question now about technology. But do you foresee, whether in running or in triathlon, us ever getting to a point where it becomes like swimming, where the suits made such a huge difference that essentially you had to rewrite the rules and kind of ban equipment in that sense? Do you foresee that ever happening in either running or triathlon?
I mean, triathlon is, since it has biking in it, it's already been down that road with the bikes in the 90s. So it's very susceptible to that, and there may be similar situations in the future. Running, I think it's hard for me to tell, but I think we're certainly at risk of that happening with these shoes. And again, I know Ross has argued very strongly that we need to ban any assistive devices in shoes right now. The Vaporfly shoes have a carbon fiber plate in them. So, and at least half a dozen shoe companies have used carbon fiber plates over the last 20 years. So they're not new, but you can make the same argument with swimming. They've just reached a point where it seems like they may well be making a difference that is competitively significant. And these shoes are not cheap. So in terms of the ideals of running, like expectations are different. This is not Formula One motor racing, and it's not even cycling. So people have a certain expectation of the degree to which equipment plays a role. No one begrudges a hockey player his carbon fiber stick, but in running, our expectation is that it's very minimally driven by technology. And if it starts to be that you can't win a race without a $350 shoe, that's not consistent with my vision of the sport. At the same time, I should say, I'm a middle distance runner. I've run one marathon, and I absolutely blew up in the last 7K or so because I have a very bouncy stride. I had massive muscle damage. I wasn't tired at all, but my legs felt like someone was stabbing knives into them. So I can't help but be attracted to the idea of a lightweight but also very cushiony shoe that might allow me to run farther without running into these muscle damage problems. So I'm a little ambivalent about it, but I definitely think it's an important debate, and I would lean towards suggesting there may be some benefit in changing the rules.
Hey, Alex, thanks again. So with kind of the recent changes in running analytics and power being one of them with Stride, was that data collected at all during Breaking 2?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I shouldn't pretend that Nike told me everything. They certainly didn't. But they were collecting just GPS and heart rate, and they were analyzing that on the basis of a critical power model. So they were doing some fairly sophisticated analyses of exactly at what point the runners should be, bonking during a workout. But they weren't using Stride, and they were using a whole bunch of other sort of equipment of middling reliability, like ultrasound to measure glycogen stores and stuff like that. And they built a jerry-rigged wind meter, an anemometer to strap to the runner's chest to help them see the differences between drafting and not drafting. But I don't believe they used a power meter. And the power meter stuff is an interesting topic, one that I haven't yet got my head around. I'm not sure I really understand what power really means in running, or whether it's just a sort of a made-up proxy for VO2 or something like that. So I don't have a fully formed opinion on that yet.
Thanks, Alex. And actually, that was kind of the direction I was coming from. In your one slide, you mentioned measurement as a critical thing, and noted biomechanics, power, and performance. And so in power, we know in cycling we can have direct measures of that. With your background in physics and that perspective then in running is what we're seeing as these current products talking about actually measuring power. Do they do that? Are they actually working from a true physics perspective? And then is there an associated value that you see at this point?
I was running this morning with a friend who we'll be hearing from tomorrow, who was wearing a power meter, and we were chatting about. I was quizzing him about this. So what does it tell you? What does it tell you that's different from the heart rate? I'm going to say I don't understand the physics of running power. That doesn't mean that there aren't true physics of running power. It may just be that I don't understand it, and I need to talk more to the Stride people and figure it out. But I don't get it, and so what I view it as is that it's a metric that is trying to essentially estimate your metabolic work rate, and they're calling it power because that's convenient, and you can then compare it to cycling. Is it useful? I haven't experimented with it, so I don't know. I understand some of the benefits that you start going up a hill and it responds instantaneously, and so that could be cool. To me, when I go up a hill, I already know I'm going up a hill, so I don't, I'm not sure what that changes for me. In general, for analytics, my general piece of advice is that they may well be useful, but if you're an obsessive person like me, be careful you don't go too far down the rabbit hole. And second of all, start with a descriptive use rather than a prescriptive use. Don't start using some new thing and have it tell you how to work out. Spend 6 months just collecting data so that you understand that when you go out on a tempo run, your power is X and your heart rate is Y, and your vertical oscillation is whatever. And then you'll be better equipped to understand what it means if something is changing, if there's some deviations. Rather than assuming that someone can tell you what those values are supposed to be, define your own norms without intervening for a long time before you start trying to change things on the basis of those metrics.
Hey, Alex. So my question's a little bit different, and I kind of wanted to come back to your ideas about what Kipchoge probably brought to the table. And that's kind of because I was thinking more about this pacing strategy you said, and I know it's kind of old hat, but likening the idea of a 2-hour marathon to running the 4-minute mile, that once someone does it, everyone's going to do it. And I'm wondering, how much you thought the psychology of all of this and this idea of can I do it or can I not do it was even the biggest contributor here after all the shoes and the nutrition and everything else.
If you ask Kipchoge, you definitely get the answer that that's a key factor. And it was amazing to speak to him. I'm generally a pretty skeptical guy, and but just speaking to him, you feel like he's preaching something. He just has this aura about him, and he's just absolutely confident. You can tell there's a difference between belief and sort of pumping yourself up. And he was just like, I can do it. And the biggest difference is that between me and everyone else is I believe it's possible and you don't. That's the only difference. That can only take you so far, right? I do believe that you could have another runner who's the physiological equal of Kipchoge who would not have run 2 flat 25 that day. He's unbelievably mentally strong. And as far as breaking down barriers, I ended up being a bit of a believer about what it would mean after that race. That they did this race under very artificial conditions, and they ran a time that was monstrously unbelievable. And I thought that is going to change what people think about it. People are going to run fast. And so I ended up writing a piece before the Berlin Marathon this year where I went out a little bit on a limb and said, I think he's going to run sub 2:02. The world is different. Fortunately, it rained, so I can claim that the world would have been different if it hadn't rained. But I mean, that piece that I wrote was a little bit, just kind of devil's advocate. I would say my evolution since my days as an athlete has been to believe that these mental factors are more important than I gave them credit for, and that I often, when people ask me okay, if you've spent all this time studying this stuff, what would you tell your younger self if you could change? And the single, probably most important thing I would tell my 21-year-old self if I could go back is get a sports psychologist. I underperformed so many times, not because my VO2 max wasn't high enough, but because my head wasn't where Kipchoge's was. And I don't think sports psychologists have all the answers, but they have some interesting ways of pushing people in the right directions, I think.
All right, thank you very much for the questions.